The morgue horror stories you're about to discover will show you that there are places where death is not the end. Prepare to hear tales of souls that refuse to leave and secrets that remain hidden in the shadows of cold, silent hallways. Like the story you're about to see, where a night at the morgue turns into a real nightmare. What seemed like a simple routine takes a dark turn when the chief brings you to the body of a child and a grim secret begins to unravel. And when the boy's mother arrives to say her final goodbye, what happens next defies all explanation. But before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our terrifying tales. I never imagined a night at the morgue could be so unsettling. I was there, as usual, finishing up the day's procedures, when Mr. Ferdinand, the chief, appeared at the door. He had this grave look, like someone carrying a heavy secret, and motioned for me to follow him to the body room. "Not a word to anyone," he said in a serious tone, as if what I was about to see shouldn't leave that room. He opened the door, and inside the refrigerator, there was a body covered with a sheet. Nothing unusual at first glance, but when he unveiled the face, my stomach knotted. It was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His eyes were closed, but his expression, that expression, it looked like he was sleeping deeply. What troubled me the most was the strange silence that filled the room. Something was off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. The strangest thing, however, happened the next day when a woman entered the morgue. I saw her from a distance walking slowly, her eyes red from crying. It was the boy's mother. She didn't say a word. She just knelt beside her son's body, touching his hand with a gentleness that seemed painful. Her grief was palpable, as if the air was filled with a silent, endless sorrow. What happened next was even stranger. When she stood up, a faint sound began to echo through the walls. Not just any sound, but a sob, an anguished sob, as if the morgue itself was filled with a pain that didn't belong there. The sound grew louder, becoming more intense, and I, not knowing what to do, looked at Mr. Ferdinand. He was as pale as I felt, but he just nodded, as if telling me not to ask questions. The worst part was when another colleague of mine, Louis, entered, and, hearing that sound, froze. He couldn't move. He could only stare into space. He was clearly terrified, and rightfully so. The sob, it didn't seem to come from a person. It sounded like something deeper, something that shouldn't be there. And then, the sound suddenly stopped, as if time had paused for a moment. It was as if an invisible presence was watching us, and somehow, I knew it wasn't over. That night, something happened. I was alone, late at night, preparing the day's documents, when the sob returned. It was no longer the distant sound I had heard before. Now it seemed closer, more real, as if it was coming from inside the body room. The sound was unmistakable, the sob of a woman, low and desperate, but it seemed to cut through the air with an intensity I never thought possible. I hesitated for a moment, but something pushed me to go. The morgue was in absolute silence except for the sob that now clearly echoed. When I entered the room, I saw it. A figure, a woman, floating there, in front of the boy's body. She didn't look human. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were red, as if burning with infinite pain. Her black dress trailed on the floor but didn't touch it. It was as if she was levitating, as if she didn't belong to this world. The sob came from her, but she didn't move. She just stood there looking at the boy with a sadness so deep it seemed to engulf everything around her. I couldn't look away. It was as if the night itself had turned into invisible hands holding me in place, preventing me from moving. Then she did something that sent chills down my spine. With incredible gentleness, she leaned over the boy's body. She touched him with her hands, a loving touch, as if she were caressing a child. A silent, terrifying pain emanated from that gesture, as if the boy's body was all that remained of a bond that not even death could break. And before I could understand what was happening, she slowly moved away and disappeared into the darkness of the room. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the spot where she had been, not knowing what to do or think. Silence returned to the morgue, but it was now filled with something I couldn't explain. The woman, or whatever she was gone, but the feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, like a sickening smell that wouldn't go away. The next morning, no one knew what had happened. Mr. Ferdinand and the other employees were in such a state of shock that no one had the courage to talk about it. I didn't know if I was dreaming, or if it was real. But deep down, I knew there was no logical explanation for what I had seen. It was a mystery that hung over us, with no solution, no answers. And then, one of the nurses, Mrs. Martha, who had been with us the previous night, said something that sent chills down my spine. The boy's mother, she believes it was La Llorona. She's convinced she came to take her son. And that's when the boy's house, which had been left by the family, remained empty. No one dared to live there after what had happened. Fear took over everything. That night at the morgue, with that sob and the spectral figure, remained etched in my memory, and despite all our efforts to move forward, even today, from time to time, we can still hear the sob. Fear has seeped into our routine in a way we could never overcome, and all of us who were there that night, including me, now avoid any contact with children's bodies. Something about that experience, something about that encounter with death, has been etched into our souls in a way that not even time could erase. And the worst part is that the story of the boy and his mother remains unexplained, a mystery we may never solve. Months have passed, but what happened that night never left my mind. The sob, the spectral figure, the loving touch on the boy's body, it all remained marked, like a scar that no one can see but is always there. Painful at times. That experience had changed something in me, and not just in me. The other employees who were there, Louis, Mrs. Martha, and even Mr. Ferdinand, were all different. It was as if they had been touched by something none of us could understand. Mr. Ferdinand, who had always been a man of few emotions, now avoided looking at children's bodies. And so did I. I felt an uncomfortable sensation every time I had to work with a child's body. It wasn't just the fear of something supernatural. It was something more visceral, something that touched our deepest emotions. The boy's house, that empty house, was always there, in the distance but constantly present in conversations. No one dared to enter it again. Neighbors said that at night they could hear strange sounds coming from there, like the sob of a woman. And the town's elders, who had already heard stories of La Llorona, said the house was cursed, that no one should go near it. But what haunted me the most was the fact that sometimes, when we were at the morgue, a cold sensation would invade the atmosphere. It was as if the presence of that woman, of that pain, was with us, lurking, waiting to take us away. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. The sob, which returned from time to time, wasn't confined to the morgue. Sometimes I heard it in the middle of the night, at home, in the silence of the darkness. And despite all my efforts to ignore it, the sound remained, piercing, cutting through my mind. We never spoke again about what we saw that night, but we all knew what was happening. The fear was palpable. For us, the case of the boy and his mother remained unanswered. No one ever knew what really happened there. And what haunted us the most was the idea that we might never know. Maybe it was a mystery that simply couldn't be solved, like so many other stories of death that remain unexplained. It was really strange, wasn't it? What did you think of the story? What would you do if something like this happened to you? Leave your answer here in the comments. Sometimes the unexpected hides in the most common places, and how something seemingly simple can trigger a series of events that challenge us to understand reality. But what you're about to see next will show you that, in some places, what is buried might not stay quiet for very long. Like in the story you're about to see next, where a quiet night at the hospital for a doctor specializing in embalming turns into a real nightmare. The night has always been my refuge. The hospital where I work, located in the suburbs of a city in Mexico, never seemed completely silent. Perhaps it was the echo of the cold walls or the whispers of the departed, but there was always something there, something that kept me on edge. I am a doctor specializing in mortuary science, a branch of medicine that few understand and even fewer dare to explore. For me, it has always been more than a career choice. It was a legacy, passed down from generation to generation. My grandparents, devout Christians, taught me that life and death are sacred cycles, and as difficult as it may be, medicine became my path. I had even considered joining the clergy, but something within me pushed me towards science, towards reason, and that is how I became who I am today. That night, like so many others, I was on duty. The hospital was almost deserted, except for the shadows moving between the walls, as if the place itself was alive, waiting for something, or someone. It was a Tuesday, I remember well, and July was coming to an end, the heat still trapped in the stifling air. The sound of the door opening echoed, and a nurse entered, pushing a cart with a covered body. The smell of formaldehyde immediately filled my nostrils. It was a young woman, probably in her 20s, with pale skin and a serene, almost ethereal face. The white dress she wore told me everything I needed to know. A nun. My faith, which had been somewhat dormant, awakened at once. Something about the silence of this young woman touched me in a way I cannot explain. It wasn't just the respect for the sacred, but there was something in her gaze. Even in death, it seemed to carry an unusual strength. This body was about to be under my scalpel, and I knew that, in one way or another, her presence would change my destiny that night. That's when Rudolph entered the room. He was a curious nurse, always present during breaks, and always with a strange obsession with corpses. He entered as usual with his smirk, and seeing the young nun on the table, he couldn't help but comment, in an indecent tone, "Look at that, doctor. What a waste of beauty. A woman so young, so pure, and now dead. A shame, huh?" I didn't respond, simply focusing on the body, beginning the embalming procedure. But Rudolph didn't just observe. He continued, "Can you imagine what we could do with her? With this body? I'm sure even she would like it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. He spoke with a disturbing naturalness, as if there was no respect for death or for the woman lying there. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my work. With each word that came out of Rudolph's mouth, the unease intensified. He was so close now that I could feel his hot breath, charged with something that seemed insane. The way he looked at the nun's body was not that of a simple nurse doing his job, but of someone who saw something much darker and repulsive. I tried to keep my calm. I took a deep breath and continued, trying to focus on what I was doing. The nun's body had to be treated with respect. But then, Rudolph took another step, dangerously close. "You know, doctor, I've seen bodies, but this one, it has something different, something almost magical. What do you say to a little exploration?" he said, almost whispering, as if trying to provoke a reaction from me. My stomach churned. It was disgusting, more than words could express. It wasn't just the vulgarity of his words, but the way he said them, as if he were challenging every vestige of morality. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I looked at him, my eyes narrowed with anger and contempt, and said, without raising my voice but firmly, "Rudolph, get out, now. This is not a place for jokes, and I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Leave." But to my surprise, he didn't move. Not only that, he took a step forward with a troubling smile on his face, and before I could react, I felt an immense force grabbing me by the neck. It was Rudolph, but something was wrong. His fingers were like claws, squeezing my throat with supernatural strength. My body was thrown against the table where the nun's body lay. I struggled, trying to free myself, trying to breathe. But what frightened me even more was the change in his face. Rudolph. It was no longer Rudolph. His face was distorted, as if something horrible possessed him. His eyes were now red, glowing like embers, and a nauseating smell of rotting flesh emanated from him, a mix of sulfur and something indescribable. Panic overwhelmed me, but the strength of his hands was unbearable. I started to feel dizzy, my lungs burning from lack of air. The vision before me began to blur. I knew that if I couldn't free myself, I wouldn't get out of there alive. And then everything became even more horrifying. Rudolph's face stretched grotesquely, his teeth elongated, resembling sharp fangs. He smiled, but not in a human way. It was a demonic smile, something I had only heard about in ancient stories and legends. I screamed, but my voice failed me. My body yielded to the pressure. Then darkness engulfed me. Everything went silent. When I woke up, I was on the floor, my body aching and an unusual feeling of weakness. My neck still burned where he had squeezed it. I slowly got up, trying to understand what had happened. I looked around, searching for any clue. That's when my eyes fell on the nun's body. Something was different. Her face, previously calm and serene, now showed a distorted expression, as if she were suffering. And when I looked at her abdomen, my blood ran cold. An inverted cross was carved there, made with the very scalpel I had used to perform the embalming. The metal gleamed under the dim light of the room, and the mark was so clear, so disturbing, that I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart raced. What the hell was going on here? I ran to the morgue door, trying to understand, but the confusion only grew. When I finally got out, I went in search of answers. I went to the security office, checking the cameras. What I saw was even more incredible. Rudolph. He wasn't at the hospital that night. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had no authorization to be in the morgue. My body went cold as I heard what happened next. Rudolph was arrested a few hours later for inappropriate acts on corpses. Not just on the nun's body, but on others as well. He had been found in the morgue, but strangely, no one knew how he had gotten in. And then the truth began to reveal itself, but not in the way I had imagined. What had happened that night transcended everything that could be understood, something that went beyond death, religion, and everything I thought I knew. I didn't know who to trust anymore, and even more frightening, the feeling that something was still watching me, wouldn't leave. What a terror. Even as science lights our way, some mysteries defy the coldest logic. The unexplainable seeps into our certainties, forcing us to face enigmas we never dreamed we'd confront. Just like in the story you're about to read, where a quiet place devoted to science and reason slowly falls prey to a mystery that defies everything we thought possible. I've always been a person of science. Nothing impressed me more than what could be proven, what was documented in a report, concrete evidence. Working in a hospital morgue, handling bodies and the mysteries each one carried, had always been mechanical work for me. My name is Marianne, and for years that was my daily routine, the calm of the cold environment where bodies awaited, silent, their fate. I never imagined that one day science would be challenged by something inexplicable. But that's exactly what happened in 2015. It was an ordinary night, or at least it should have been. I was alone, as always, in the morgue. I had just finished the autopsy of a woman who seemed to have been a victim of poisoning. Her eyes were empty. Her body no longer reacted to anything, but as I removed my gloves, I felt something strange in the air. Then I saw it. Her wrists began to close, slowly, as if there was still a part of life, a will. And that wasn't all. Her body, already lifeless, trembled. The cold sensation that invaded the room was indescribable. And then, something even stranger happened. A strong, sweet, masculine scent filled the air around the corpse. I stopped. I didn't know what to do. I tried to ignore what my eyes and nose were telling me. But at that moment, the only possible reaction was to run out of the room. I didn't tell anyone. After all, who would believe such a thing? A scent, a body moving inexplicably. It seemed like a mix of a nightmare and a hallucination. I went into the room with the other bodies, tried to continue my work and forget what had just happened. But I couldn't. The scent was still there. I wondered how I could have imagined all that until I was called for another autopsy. This time, a man. He had died of a heart attack. When I entered the room, the same masculine scent was there. The same. How was that possible? The only link between the two bodies was one fact. The man was the husband of the woman I had just examined. I was paralyzed. The scent was there, dense in the air, and now everything took on a terrifying meaning. The man, whom I would never have imagined having a connection with what had happened that night, was the husband of the woman I had autopsied earlier. That woman. What was her connection to all this? When I started examining his body, I discovered something else. During the analysis, I noticed a detail that did not appear in the initial reports. The man seemed to have undergone extreme stress before dying, as if something had completely overwhelmed him. Then, an idea came to me. What the relatives had said about him. What I had never taken seriously until then. They had said that before he died, he had screamed desperately. He had said that his wife had appeared to him, already dead. And now, the scent, the smell, the same one I had smelled on her body, on his, like a mark, a signature. I no longer knew what to think. What was happening? This story was taking on proportions that far exceeded what science had taught me to understand. As I investigated the case, I began to connect the dots, and something deeply shocked me. The woman's poisoning. The husband perhaps was responsible. He might have used poison to kill her, but somehow, she hadn't let him go. She hadn't let her story end like that. And what frightened me the most was that before he died, he seemed to have understood. I no longer knew if I was dealing with a homicide or something much, much darker. What was happening in that morgue? What were those bodies trying to tell me? It wasn't just the story of a tragic death. There was something bigger, something I couldn't understand, but which seemed to push me to a limit between reason and the impossible. That incident, that scent, the involuntary movement of the woman's body, none of it fit the logic of science. How could someone like me, so attached to evidence and facts, understand the inexplicable? It shook my faith in the control I believed I had over death, over the end. What I was witnessing could not simply be filed away in reports. It was a mystery that would continue to haunt my mind, no matter how many years passed. And that's what marked me, what made me think. That night in the morgue, those bodies, the scent, remained like a shadow over my career, something I could never erase. No matter how much I tried to rationalize, deep down, I knew that something far beyond science had infiltrated my world. Something that made me question what happens after death. Something inexplicable that would continue to haunt me forever. What a strange story. Have you ever wondered what really happens in places where death is just the beginning of something bigger? The mystery of an ancient and inexplicable presence confronts us with the unknown, with no easy answers. Only the growing sensation that something dark is unfolding. Like in the story you're about to see next, where, in an apparently ordinary environment, noises and shadows begin to reveal long-buried secrets. But before continuing the story, if you've made it this far, it means you enjoy our stories, so don't forget to leave a like to let YouTube know you appreciate this type of content and never miss another horror story. I've always had a very strong intuition, a sort of sixth sense, but that night, it seemed to be screaming at me. My name is Laura, a mortuary technician at the hospital in Brittany, and that foggy night, something felt off. I felt an odd heaviness, even before leaving my house. An unease followed me, as if something was watching, trailing me. I took a deep breath, tried to shake off the bad feeling, but it lingered. I arrived at the morgue with a sense that the air was denser than usual, as if the night had already swallowed every trace of light. The document I had received indicated an unclaimed woman's body, but upon arrival I looked at the drawers, the shelves, and nothing. There was no body matching the name and details. My eyes frantically scanned the papers and drawer numbers, but the woman who should have been there wasn't. My breathing quickened. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to understand what was happening, until my gaze fell on something unexpected, a black pearl bracelet, with a golden initial gleaming under the dim light. It had nothing to do with the body I was supposed to find. I looked around, searching for an explanation, But before I could think any further, a chill ran down my spine. The medical examiner in charge of the documentation was absent, and I was alone, with no support. An icy cold seemed to invade the place, and the silence was profound, as if something was about to happen. That's when I started hearing the first noises, low whispers coming from an undefined place. My nerves were on edge. The job, which should have been routine, now seemed unbearable. I couldn't focus. The shadows around me seemed to grow as time passed. Then, I felt as if the woman's body had vanished. The sensation was indescribable, but it was real. And upon rechecking the papers once more, I noticed something even more disturbing. The information was erased. It made no sense. It was impossible not to think that something supernatural was involved. How could the body just disappear like that? How to explain what I was feeling, what I was hearing? The sensation that something ancient, something dark, was lurking. Days passed, but that night wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, the vision of the black pearl bracelet with the golden initial surfaced before me. There was something there, something I didn't understand, but I knew it was connected to what happened that night. And as if fate wanted to test me, I was called back. This time the body was of another patient, but the link to the previous case was undeniable. When I looked at the papers, the name hit me like a punch to the gut. The medical examiner who was absent that night. He had died mysteriously. There was no explanation for his death. The autopsy revealed nothing, only more questions. But what worried me even more was that I felt the case was far from over. Something was hiding behind all this. I remembered what I had found in the drawer, the black pearl bracelet. It continued to haunt my thoughts. It couldn't be a coincidence. I connected the dots and my mind began to trace an increasingly dark path. The unclaimed woman, the vanished body, and the medical examiner dead inexplicably. It was all intertwined somehow. This woman who had been left behind seemed to have something very ancient, something hiding in the shadows. I began to believe she wasn't just an ordinary woman. Something in her aura, in her eyes that I never saw. Something there told me she was more than human. I started to suspect she was a witch, someone who had been forgotten in time but whose powers hadn't vanished. I was being drawn into something much bigger than I could understand. More and more the night seemed denser, as if the fog of Brittany was swallowing me, and the noises in the morgue, the whispers, and grew louder each day. I knew something dark was hiding behind it all, something that didn't want to be discovered. I was aware that my life was turning into an endless nightmare. Every time I entered that morgue, it seemed like something was watching me closely. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it. And as I investigated the woman further, I found that my own sanity was being tested. It was taking a toll on me. It was no longer just the body I was preparing to be wrapped. It was my own soul that was being invaded. I no longer knew where reality ended and the nightmare began. The morgue doors seemed to close around me, and I saw myself increasingly trapped. Now, I had to know the truth. Why was this woman, who seemed lost in time, so connected to the medical examiner, and what was still hidden in that dark and silent morgue? I had no answers, but I felt that if I continued, the worst was yet to come. Scary, isn't it? Sometimes the unexpected comes from the most unlikely places, bringing to the surface fears we'd rather never face. Like in the story you're about to see next, where the most common environment can hide the greatest mysteries, and a simple body drags those involved into terrifying discoveries about something far beyond what they could imagine. It was an ordinary afternoon at the morgue, but that tranquility soon turned into a nightmare. I was there, filing some papers, when Peter, my assistant, rushed in. His face was pale, and his usually calm eyes were agitated, as if he had witnessed something strange. "George, you won't believe what happened on my way to work," he said, panting, still trying to catch his breath. He leaned against the wall and seemed to avoid my gaze. "I saw an accident, a car accident. The woman didn't..." didn't look good. Peter seemed to struggle for words, as if reliving the accident was too much for him. I approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down. "Peter, breathe. Let's focus on what we need to do. We'll handle this, stay calm." But he was far from calm. The following minutes were tense until the woman's body arrived. She looked to be in her 70s, her face pale and her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The ambulance had brought her in with multiple injuries, and the medical examiner quickly told us she had been hit head-on. But what really troubled me was Peter's behavior. He stood still for a long moment, staring at the corpse. Do you know her, Peter?" I asked, trying to understand his reaction. He looked at me, panic written all over his face. "Yes, George, I know her." His response was cold, as if he were somewhere else, not in the morgue. She's from my hometown," he stammered, as if each word was a struggle. As the autopsy was about to begin, I tried to distract my assistant from the situation, but something started to happen. During the preparation, I noticed something strange. The woman's eyes, which were open, began to move slowly. It wasn't a blink, it was something more subtle, as if she were observing something around her. "Peter, do you see that?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He glanced quickly, and his expression of terror was impossible to hide. He stepped back, almost stumbling. "George, this can't be happening, it can't." He was visibly in shock, his breathing accelerated. And before I could respond, I noticed something even more frightening. The woman began to drool. The liquid flowed from her mouth, a thick and viscous stream. The atmosphere became dense, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Calm down, Peter. Let's keep going. We need to finish this," I said, trying to give an impression of normalcy to what was happening, but my voice seemed to waver. That's when the unexpected happened. The woman's body, still apparently lifeless, moved with sudden violence. Her arm shot up forcefully, and in a brutal motion she bit Peter. He screamed in desperation, and I saw blood spurt. In an instant, Peter's finger was gone, torn off by the woman's attack. I pushed her away, and she fell back onto the autopsy table. "Let's go, Peter. Let's get to the ER, I shouted, grabbing him by the shoulders and dragging him out of the room, trying not to look at the woman's body. I rushed Peter to the ER as quickly as possible, not saying a single word. Fear was still etched on his face, and I didn't know what to think. What had happened in that autopsy room? What had really attacked Peter? My brain tried to make sense of it all, but it was hard to find explanations. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctors quickly treated Peter's wound, but he wasn't getting better. He was in shock, almost as if he were delirious. She's not dead, George," Peter murmured, his gaze distant. "I saw her eyes. I saw..." He repeated this to himself, as if trying to convince himself he wasn't crazy. I knew he needed help, but something inside me told me he was telling the truth. After a few hours, I decided to return to the morgue. I had to understand what was going on. Upon returning, I entered the autopsy room, but what I found made me stop dead in my tracks. The woman's body was gone. The table was empty. There was no sign that anyone had touched her. The emptiness in the air was denser than ever, and a cold sensation washed over me, as if the morgue itself was breathing erratically. My stomach knotted. I had the feeling I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and entered the room cautiously, growing more apprehensive with each step. That's when something cold touched my shoulder. The chill spread like an electric shock, and I turned around quickly. She was there. The woman. She was standing behind me, her eyes fixed on mine, but there was something else on her face. Her expression was transformed, something grotesque, a twisting of the jaw, as if her mouth was contorting. Before I could react, her jaw dislocated with a horrible snap, falling to the floor with a macabre thud. She collapsed right after, her body crumpling with uncontrolled force, as if possessed by some demonic energy. It all happened so fast that my body couldn't react immediately. I didn't know if I should run or confront it, and before any thought could form in my mind, a low and terrifying voice echoed through the room. "You should have let me rest." It was her, The woman, or what was left of her, seemed to speak directly into my mind, and then everything was revealed. She was a witch, Peter said when I went back to see him at the hospital. I knew her in my hometown. I always knew there was something strange about her, but no one dared to question her. She performed rituals, summoned forces that even the elders wouldn't dare to understand. Peter was pale, his eyes wide. He seemed to be reliving every second of that accident, as if he were trapped in that moment. And then he told me something that made me even more tense. I saw the accident, George. I caused it. She was trying to grab me. I didn't know it was her. She cursed me. Peter seemed repentant, as if he knew what had happened wasn't just a coincidence. I didn't know how to handle this. What should I do? How should I react to all this? I had the nightmare that Peter was right, that the woman, this witch, was somehow coming back for revenge. I refused to return to the morgue. That body, that thing, was still out there somewhere, waiting to finish what it had started. The feeling that something was about to happen consumed me, and I knew the supernatural wasn't just a legend. The experience I had left me with a doubt I've never been able to resolve. What was real about what happened in that morgue, and what else could still be hiding in the shadows of death? What a frightening story. What did you think of it? What would you do if something like this happened to you? Leave your thoughts here in the comments. It was a cold and silent night in 2003 when the routine at the morgue felt even heavier than usual. I, Charlie Harris, a medical examiner, was alone on duty that night, as I often was. The other doctors and nurses had left, and the city seemed to be in a deep sleep, but the morgue was far from quiet. The radio crackled with soft music, trying to break the oppressive silence. But something told me an event was about to occur. When the main door opened, a police officer entered, pushing a gurney. On it lay the body of a man, which was nothing new to me. What caught my attention, however, was the state of the corpse. It was visibly deteriorated, but not in a usual way. There were signs of extreme violence, knife wounds, and bruises scattered across the face and body. But the strangest thing was the decomposition. It seemed accelerated, as if the body was in a stage that shouldn't be possible. Something was off. Curious and concerned, I conducted an initial inspection, trying not to be too disturbed by the condition of the corpse. I prepared to begin the autopsy, turning on the lights and adjusting the instruments with a precision that had become almost mechanical over the years. I began to incise the skin, focusing on the layers of muscles and tissues. But then, something happened. At first, it was just murmurs, as if someone was whispering, coming directly from the body. I looked at the gurney, bewildered. I knew death was silent, but what I was hearing now, it wasn't possible. Were my ears playing tricks on me? I went further, not wanting to give in to panic. I continued the dissection, but the murmurs intensified, turning into something almost audible. With a knot in my stomach, I decided to investigate deeper, opening the abdominal cavity. That's when things got even stranger. In the stomach, I found something that made no sense. Fragments of bone. Not animal bones, as one might expect in a case of cannibalism or something similar, but human fragments, as if someone had chewed and swallowed pieces of bone, and in a very strange way. I froze for a moment, trying to piece together what was happening, but I couldn't. The body was dead, even more dead than a corpse should be. Then something even more terrifying happened. The corpse, this murdered man, began to move. At first it was a slight movement of the fingers, then the arms began to twist. This wasn't possible. I knew what death did. I knew that rigor mortis was inevitable. But what I was seeing with my own eyes was inexplicable. The corpse, already lifeless, began to sit up. No, this wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. And yet it was. And then, the body began to change. The decomposition accelerated at an impossible rate. The skin began to tear, and dark, thick, wild hairs began to grow, as if death was being defied, as if the body was transforming into something inhuman. Before I could make a move, what stood before me was no longer a man. but a grotesque beast. The transformation completed, and with a final crack, the body collapsed. I fell to the floor, unconscious from the horrible sight, from the intensity of what I had just witnessed. And then, darkness. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was a crushing weight on my chest, labored, difficult breathing, a sudden heat invading my body, and then pain. It was as if my heart was trying to escape my chest. I could barely breathe, and when I looked at my hands, they were shaking violently. A heart attack. I knew it. I was having one, and the fear of dying there at the morgue with no one around paralyzed me even more. But somehow, I managed to call for help. A nurse heard my cries, rushed in and took me to the nearest hospital. I was treated, stabilized, but the trauma, what I had seen, what had happened to that body, it wouldn't leave my mind. After a few weeks of recovery, I returned to the morgue. I knew I had to face that place again, but something was different. The atmosphere seemed heavier, as if it was still connected to something that shouldn't be there. And then came the shock. The body of that murdered man, had disappeared, simply vanished. When I went to see the room where the corpse should have been, the gurney was empty. There was no trace, no logical explanation. What could have happened? I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't a hallucination. So, I investigated. I asked my colleagues, the police officers who had brought the body. No one knew anything. They were as bewildered as I was, and no one was willing to even consider that something strange could have happened. It was then, during one of my visits to the local market, that I heard something that could explain what had happened. A healer, someone known in the city, told me that the corpse I had autopsied could have been that of a Nahal, a kind of sorcerer, a being with the ability to manipulate death. He explained that according to ancient legends, these beings could come back to life after death, take monstrous forms, and distort reality at will. I was skeptical, of course, but what I had seen, there was no other explanation. I could no longer consider it a simple hallucination, a mental error after the trauma. The idea that it could have really been a Nahal, a being with power over death, haunted me. In the following days, things only got worse. At night, when the morgue was in absolute silence, I began to see something. A figure, a shadow, almost imperceptible but always present. I saw it in the corners of the room, in the reflections of the window glass on the walls. It was the same figure, but different each time I saw it. Sometimes it seemed to be a man, other times a beast, like the body that had transformed before my eyes. I knew deep down that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. My colleagues, those who were with me that night, began to think I was suffering from post-traumatic hallucinations. They said it was all a reflection of what had happened, a side effect of witnessing such violence. And in a way, they were right. I was traumatized, but there was something real. I could feel it. Despite all the warnings from my own mind, I accepted that what had happened in that morgue was real. And in some way, it continued to haunt me. I couldn't just ignore what I had seen. So I began to work with more caution, more attention to everything around me. I knew the morgue would never be the same for me. But what if the Nahal was really watching me? What if it had never left, just waiting for the right moment to return? I knew there was more, something still hidden. The fear, that constant fear, never left me. Terrifying. Sometimes the line between life and death becomes so thin that what seems like a goodbye turns into something else, something that defies our understanding. What starts as a learning experience becomes a mystery that can change everything. Like in the story you just read, where the mystery involves a mentor who, after death, leaves signs that perhaps the goodbye is never final. An experience that will make whoever lives it question what is real and what is not. I remember my first day at the morgue like it was yesterday. Fresh out of school, I could hardly believe I was finally there, starting my career. I was nervous, but also excited. The place, quiet and full of mystery, had an air of respect. I knew I was about to learn more than I could imagine, but I had no idea how much this experience would change my life. My mentor, Dr. Michael, was quite the character. Patient, meticulous. He had a unique way of teaching. Nothing escaped his notice. Every movement had a purpose. He always spoke calmly, as if he knew time was precious, and consequently, nothing was rushed. I soaked it all in. How to make a precise incision, how to understand the intricacies of the human body. He made it all seem so natural, but I knew there was so much more behind his experience. He was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. In the days that followed, Michael started mentioning that he was planning to take a vacation, which seemed to excite him more than anything else. He talked about the places he wanted to visit, as if this trip would free him from all the stress accumulated over years of work. I listened with a bit of envy, thinking about how good it would feel to reach a point where I could take such a break from this kind of life. And then, the day came. Michael told me he would be away for a few days, and to my surprise, he would be replaced by another doctor, someone I had never met before. I felt strangely alone. Michael wasn't just my mentor. He was almost a father figure, someone I trusted. But of course I knew life had to go on, and this replacement was part of the process. On my last night as an apprentice, as I was finishing a shift, the chief came to me with a grave expression. He told me Michael wouldn't be coming back. He won't be returning, was all he said. The shock was instant. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Whatever had happened, I didn't know, but the emptiness in my chest made me wonder what could have occurred. But the strangest part was yet to come. That same night, as I was about to start an autopsy, something inexplicable happened. Dr. Michael appeared. He walked into the morgue as if nothing was wrong, with his usual smile. He seemed calm, as if nothing had changed. "You'll do everything right," he said with the same confidence as always. I didn't know what to think. How could he be there when I had just learned of his death? The sight of Michael there in front of me was so surreal that it took me a while to grasp what was happening. He seemed normal. Nothing out of the ordinary, not a ghost or anything like that, as if he had simply returned to supervise what I was doing. His presence calmed me in an inexplicable way. He talked about the autopsy procedures, giving a few tips as he always did. Remember to be gentle in the most sensitive areas and never rush the process, he said, as if it were a warning he always repeated. What really troubled me was the tone of farewell in his voice. It wasn't something I could clearly explain, but it seemed like he was trying to say goodbye in a way I didn't yet understand. The way he looked at me, with that serene smile, something in his eyes suggested he knew our time together was coming to an end. A few minutes later, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air felt denser, and the morgue's light seemed a bit dimmer, almost as if reality had begun to warp. That's when my phone rang, breaking the heavy silence in the room. It was a call from the hospital. "We have an update. Dr. Michael passed away a few hours ago." I froze. It was the final blow that shattered any illusion that Michael could be there for a rational reason. How could he be there, giving advice and saying goodbye if he had died earlier? My body went cold. I couldn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at the corpse I had just started to autopsy, the same one that had just received a visit from Michael. The room seemed to close in around me. No one believed me when I told them what had happened. They thought I was dreaming, or maybe the mind of a novice was playing tricks on reality. "It was just the pressure," they said. "Your brain was tired." But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't a hallucination. What disturbed me even more was what happened next. When I finished Michael's autopsy, my mentor's corpse was different. His face, which had previously been in an expression of tranquility, now seemed to be smiling. A soft smile, as if he had finally found some peace. The smile wasn't one of pain. It wasn't macabre. It was warm, as if he was satisfied with everything he had done and, in a way, telling me that everything was okay, that I would be okay too. That image of Michael's face stayed with me forever. I couldn't stop thinking about it. He had been my mentor, someone who had guided me with patience, and now it seemed that in some way he wanted to leave me with this final gesture of affection. That night, I was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. I had lost someone who had become a true inspiration to me, but the way he had said goodbye, it never ceased to be a mysterious and inexplicable memory that, in some way, gave me the strength to continue. Michael is gone, but in some way, he remains with me. A figure of wisdom and calm who, even after death, left his mark on me. What happened in that morgue that night can't be explained, but for me, it will never be just a memory. It was something beyond reality, something that made me realize that in moments of transition, the inexplicable can touch us in ways we can't fully understand, but that somehow will always stay with us. Thanks for watching this far. Which story did you like the most? And which one did you like the least? Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps the channel grow, and you won't miss any horror stories.